Over 600 dead. Over 100 still missing. Over 200,000 displaced. And over 2 million Sri Lankans island-wide affected. Cyclone Ditwah was not just another extreme weather event on Sri Lanka's weather disaster calendar. It was a stress test. Put to stress were not just Sri Lankans, but Sri Lanka's early warning systems, disaster response, and even Sri Lankan institutions. In just days, parts of the country received over 500 millimeters of rain. That's more than some cities see in an entire year. Floods swallowed homes, landslides erased villages, and millions were pushed into uncertainty. But the real question came after the rain stopped. Was this an anomaly or was this a warning? This is Spotlight on the Derana News channel. I'm Aditya Singha, and on this edition of Spotlight, we intend to discuss what made Cyclone Ditwah so different, why storms are becoming harder to predict and more dangerous, and what must Sri Lanka change before the next one hits. First off, what set Cyclone Ditwah apart from Sri Lanka's recent experience with adverse weather?
What was particularly complicated about Ditwah was that it was a very slow-moving system. So once it had reached Sri Lanka, it was picking up a huge amount of moisture from the ocean. So this led to why there was such extreme rainfall event. Red Crescent Climate Center has done an analysis of the storm, which also suggests that it's some of this is due to climate change, so that the increased ocean temperatures are contributing to these large amounts of moisture that these storms are picking up.
That was Dr. David Rogers. Dr. Rogers is the president of the Health and Climate Foundation, former chief executive of the UK's Met Office, former director of the Office of Weather and Air Quality at the US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and a global expert on climate-related disaster risk. What Dr. Rogers says is that this is not just extreme weather. This is a compound risk. Slow-moving storms mean prolonged rainfall. Warmer oceans mean more moisture. And rapid intensification means less time to prepare. Now here's the problem. Forecasts aren't probabilistic. It's uncertain. The danger isn't uncertainty. The danger is not acting early enough when uncertainties arise.
So the intensity of this was pretty much unprecedented in Sri Lanka, but according to their analysis, this is likely to become a more frequent event. So meaning really that it is more likely that these types of extremes will happen within a lifetime. Consequently, really we need to pay attention to the fact that we're going to have to cope with much higher rainfall and rainfall intensity. The cyclone was unusual also because it intensified very quickly. So from a relatively normal cyclonic event into something really intense occurred very, very fast, which is another problem in terms of coping with it. Because you need to have you have to be prepared. And of course, if it's for very rapid intensification, if you're not ready for it, you will have difficulty coping, which was the case, of course.
Now, 200 millimeters of rainfall is disruptive, but 500 millimeters of rainfall is catastrophic. According to the Red Cross, that is the difference between 2 feet of water and 14 feet of water. But most warnings are communicated as facts and figures, not as consequences. And when people don't know what the consequences are, they don't know how to act. This is what experts call last mile communication failure, and that can be deadly.
The biggest problem is forecasting the amount of rainfall that will occur. It's so extreme. Most of the global models do not capture the kinds of rainfall that was experienced, which is over 500 millimeters of rainfall. That doesn't mean you can't use the information and make better outcomes, but there are still scientific gaps. But it's not unique to Sri Lanka. This is a problem for the field of atmospheric sciences. Progress is being made, but we always need to understand that we're dealing with considerable uncertainty. And the question here is, in terms of communication, this is where things fell down. The failure of the communication network, too much dependence on centralization and not enough sort of distributed responsibility around the country. This is where I think we need to address that. So it's the last mile communication is really important. And in that, when we say last mile, we really mean people have to be able to understand the information they have. People have a difficulty really understanding that, and much more effort has to be made at the community level, not just communities, but in a district level, in private sector, in businesses. Everybody needs to have a much better understanding of the risks they face.
Now, floodwaters eventually recede, but disasters don't end there. In the wake of cyclone's destruction, health experts warned of a various number of epidemics that could break out in the wake of Cyclone Ditwah. They cited typhoid, they cited leptospirosis, dysentery, diarrhea, and so on and so forth. But are these physical ailments the only health concerns that Sri Lankans must be wary of?
Sri Lanka could cope with the obvious health risks from a point of view of water contamination and potential disease outbreak. I think that the hidden threat is more to do with the last thing you said, and that's mental health. It's just a disaster which has affected so many people, and the result of that is people are traumatized. Society has to really think very hard about how to manage that, and of course a lot of it is to improve our education, so that we feel like we're more in control. Because in any natural event, a natural hazard, you're not in control of it, right? You can't stop the rain, but you can do things obviously to lessen the impact if you know what to do. I would say that's the hidden health impact. It will have a serious effect on how people behave in the future, and we need to really take that very, very seriously.
Now, as Sri Lanka reeled under the whirlwinds of Cyclone Ditwah, emergency response teams stretched thin, scrambled island-wide to rescue those in desperate need. While emergency teams did save hundreds of lives from imminent danger, concerns arose about whether Sri Lanka's emergency response systems, healthcare, evacuation and disaster relief perform at a level one would expect given its resources.
No, I don't think so. And I think it's wrongly organized, frankly. I think we know there's understaffing throughout most central government departments, but I also think that the approach isn't quite right. And if I were to compare it with other countries, it's not so much about the resources, it's about how things are organized. It's a co-production problem, it's co-developing of solutions. It involves everybody. And what you have is an emergency or disaster response system that focuses on command and control, centralization. It's got to change. When we say, well, you haven't got enough people to fill certain positions, that's true, but that's also not looking at the fact that we're all responsible in some way, and therefore there has to be a lot more, you could call it ability to self-rescue. I mean, it's taking care of yourself and your community. What can the community do? And work from that end rather than from the top down. So I actually think that's where the performance is poor. It's got all the elements on paper, but it's very much stuck in. We have mandates, we have committees, we do these sorts of things, but that doesn't translate into a very functional distributed system throughout the country where people can take better action for themselves and their communities, rather than everything being managed from a central point. Yes, for communication, that's very important, and it's very important to have a common message, but when it comes to actually taking action, everyone has a role to play.
Now, Cyclone Ditwah also left its mark on Sri Lanka's infrastructure. According to estimates, the RDA says that they suffered a loss worth 75 billion rupees, and they say that 190 billion rupees are required to restore the damaged roads around the country. Now, meanwhile, the Ceylon Electricity Board has incurred an estimated loss of approximately 20 billion rupees. The National Water Supply and Drainage Board has incurred an estimated loss of approximately 5.6 billion rupees. The World Bank estimates that Cyclone Ditwah has caused $4.1 billion in direct damages to buildings, agriculture and critical infrastructure equivalent to about 4% of Sri Lanka's GDP. Nearly 2 million people were affected, with all 25 districts experiencing flooding and extreme rainfall. The central province was the worst hit. The Kandy district alone recorded damages of $689 million, mainly due to flooding and landslides, making it the hardest hit district. Infrastructure was the most affected sector, accounting for $1.735 billion or 42% of the total damage. Nearly 70% of the railway network was rendered unusable, slowing relief efforts and economic recovery. The report estimates $985 million in residential losses, with more than 6,000 houses completely destroyed and over 112,000 partially damaged, leaving thousands of families displaced. After suffering literal billions in financial setbacks, can Sri Lanka build back better?
We have a disaster not because of the hazard, we have a disaster because of the impact of it and the lack of ability to cope. Often the problem is we rush to fix everything. Obviously, you have to fix the basic things. You've got to get things working again so that they can function. But if we simply put everything back that was broken, will fail. And that's the tendency, is that we just build back. The problem is that we rush to sort of make patching up things rather than actually fundamentally fixing them. Changing the way we actually approach the problem needs to be thought through. And that doesn't happen very, very much. And it leads to a position where the same thing will happen again. You can look at the history of severe weather impacts on Sri Lanka. We're repeating ourselves. This was more extreme in terms of the weather event. Why? We know it's a country which faces extreme weather events. That's a fact. That's unavoidable. But we don't solve the problem permanently because we're not really addressing the right things at times. And I think that's what goes wrong. It's that we put things back, but we don't really move forward in increasing resilience.
Seeing the wide-scale destruction caused to Sri Lanka's infrastructure, we must wonder if our infrastructure is climate resilient. In fact, agriculture was one of the hardest hit sectors in the wake of this crisis. Let's take a look at this graph. This indicates the extent of damage caused to paddy fields, vegetable and other cultivations across the island. Over 108,000 hectares of paddy fields experienced total damage, and more than 6,000 hectares of vegetables and other farmlands suffered heavy damage as well.
But it's not just about growing the food, it's actually about food supply, food security, right? So when we need to look at what are the interconnections between different aspects of infrastructure, we tend to silo our response. So we'll focus on roads reconstruction, for example, or road infrastructure. We may focus on schools, building robust schools, but they're connected. Those are competing interests at times. They have to be more effectively managed so that when that infrastructure is in place, it shouldn't be a competition. Those decisions should be known. What we will do when we have limited water availability. What do we do when there may be, as happened in this case, we have a drought, we have low water in some areas, and then we have a massive inflow of water due to the rainfall. We have to understand those things, and we have to understand how the knock-on effects. So we can, what is the cascading impact of failure in one sector on another, and this isn't handled very well. And this is why when we want to build back, we want an infrastructure, we want to understand the interconnections between different infrastructures and look at the weaknesses, look at the potential impacts of a failure in one on another, and then try to address those risks, thinking that through as a complete system as opposed to isolated, siloed infrastructure investments in particular sectors. We risk that always, and testing it before we actually make those investments to understand what the vulnerabilities are.
Now, many argue that Sri Lanka doesn't have the financial capability to build back better. But according to what experts say, Cyclone Ditwah is just a precursor to more devastating cyclones and other inclement weather-related disasters to follow in the future. So, how can countries, resource-strapped countries, build climate-resilient economies around the world?
I think it doesn't mean that it has to cost a huge amount. It's a matter of being smarter in a way So maybe it's better to say build back smarter, and that is to think about the vulnerabilities within the infrastructure that have been shown from the disaster, and not simply say let's just build another road where there was a road, or let's not if we're going to rebuild a community where there are a lot of houses have been lost, let's try to make sure that they are actually located in a more effective end. This is very difficult, obviously. Not at huge expense. It's huge emotional expense, obviously. But from a financial point of view, a lot of things can be done that are making things more resilient in simpler ways. It's really being smart about the investments of the future, not so much about it's costing a huge amount. Of course, it's expensive, but it's not out of reach of any society, and particularly Sri Lankan society. But I think one point is also you've got to make sure that the economy is working. So one of the things that is really important in building a more resilient and a smarter society is to ensure that you have minimum disruption to the economy of the country, which is a problem that you faced over many years in terms of economic disruption, but that needs to be looked at. But doesn't necessarily translate into huge costs. It's into how do you prioritize certain things that will keep the economy developing.
Every crisis is an opportunity to learn, and Cyclone Ditwah is no exception. With rebuilding efforts now underway, grim memories still linger fresh in mind. While we heal ourselves, we must also be aware of a few key takeaways from this disaster in our pursuit to build a climate-resilient Sri Lanka.
Everyone has to participate. Everyone has to have a much better understanding of the risks. Everyone. And there's no reason why that can't happen through education, through community engagement in decision making. We all need to make decisions. Everybody does. But those decisions need to be informed. And so let's call them, they should be weather intelligent decisions. We need to really take that into account. And we need everyone to feel that they're part of it. People need to trust, but they will only trust if they understand. So first and foremost, people need to understand the risk. They will have to understand that in this changing climate, those risks are likely to become more severe and they need to be managed effectively. We need to all have a picture of what happens if such an event occurs. These are the things that could happen, and how do we then take effective action early enough, collectively, to reduce those risks. Post-disaster, from what I've seen, people are extremely capable of helping each other, but they need to be equally capable before the event. And that's where I think we could strengthen that capability. Second would be to really start to analyze the gaps in information. And part of that then is linked to making sure that you have these really robust networks so that when one part fails, it can be picked up somewhere else. That there's far more cooperation between different parts of society to help each other before we actually put too much effort into rebuilding, in physically building. So there's a lot of thinking that has to go in, but I would say fundamentally, more people have to be brought in to think about the problem for themselves, work together, local governments, local communities, businesses, all need to play a very significant role. And I think I see some of that happening already. But I do think that ought to be a real push, that this is, the Ministry of Home Affairs should be driving a lot of things that are going to be needed in the future. The central government needs to respond to that because they will be helping identify gaps that are needed. And then decisions can be made about where those future investments are going to be made. But there are some very clear first steps that could be done.
That was Dr. David Rogers speaking on Spotlight on the Derana News channel. Signing off, I'm Aditya Edrisinghe.